So the first thing I want you to kind of think about is, why is the U.S. getting involved in these parts of the world? What is changing in America in this time period that is allowing us to get more involved? So think about, industrial advancements, progressivism, and immigration, and all of these things that are going on in the United States at this time. So that's kind of where we are picking up. So we'll start with Cuba. So at the end of the Spanish-American War, we had basically agreed that Cuba was not going to become a U.S. colony. So instead it became what we call a protectorate, where basically the idea here is that the U.S. is going to protect Cuba, and in return, Cuba is going to have kind of some good deals with the United States. They passed a law known as the Platt Amendment, where basically the United States can intervene freely in Cuba's affairs whenever Cuba's getting involved in another country or in trade, economics. The United States is going to have a lot of influence in Cuba. And basically what they're saying is like, well, hey, we helped you win independence from Spain. Like, don't you want us to help you out, right? So that's kind of where that comes in. They also say, as part of the Platt Amendment, that Cuba is not allowed to go into debt. There is still a great deal of American businessmen in Cuba. If Cuba goes into debt, it is going to hurt American business, so that's not something that we want. If that means we have to intervene in their economy, that's what we're going to do. We also established a naval base at Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay. So if you look down here, this is in the southern part of Cuba. This is a base that is still U.S. owned and operated, right? So think about what's happening here. We say Cuba is not a colony, but we're treating it like one. Right? We're treating it like this is U.S. territory, U.S. influence. So that's something that's going to become a really big deal as part of Cuba. Okay. So next we have the Philippines. So at the end of the Spanish-American War, how did we get the Philippines? Think about it. Okay. We purchased it for $20 million, right? So the Philippines is in Indonesia, south of Japan, near China, that kind of area there. And after the United States had been involved there for a while, the Philippines actually rebel against U.S. control. It's going to be a 3-year war. It's going to cost about $400 million in order for us to kind of maintain them. And the idea behind this war was, remember, we have a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo who had led a revolution against the Spanish. We sent troops over there and kind of helped them out. And then we took control of them, right? They were like, dude, you helped us overthrow one colonial leader, and now you're going to become a colonial leader? That's not cool, right? So that's why they rebel against U.S. control there. Remember, this is also where Taft is serving as governor. So he's pretty involved in the decisions that are made in the Philippines and what happens there. They do not gain independence from the United States until 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II. And after the rebellion, we kind of crack down on them a lot, take away some of their rights and freedoms. So that's kind of how we get involved in the Philippines. The next we have is Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is another territory that we gain at the end of the Spanish-American War. So we kind of win it, right? At the end of the war, we pay for the Philippines, but we win Puerto Rico. And we kind of treat Puerto Rico pretty heavy-handedly. We, again, don't give them a lot of freedoms, don't give them a lot of rights. We pass an act called the Foraker Act. This denies Puerto Ricans American citizenship. We get to kind of appoint most of their leaders and their government. Puerto Rico is a territory. It is not technically a state. However, other U.S. territories got U.S. citizenship, but we did not give that to Puerto Rico. In 1917, so after Woodrow Wilson becomes president, eventually Puerto Ricans are going to become U.S. citizens. And Puerto Rico is still today a U.S. territory. There is some debate over statehood and whether or not Puerto Rico wants to or should become a state. They don't have any say in the federal government, but U.S. laws still apply to Puerto Rico. But they do have some other flexibility as well. They're exempt from taxes and other things. So there are some pros and cons for Puerto Rico being considered still a territory instead of a state. And again, that's what I was just talking about here. They remain a territory, or a commonwealth is another word for that, but not a U.S. state. Next, we have China. So China is really interesting in this time period because Everybody wants a piece of China, but they're not taking control of China. Instead, what we have is something called spheres of influence, where basically, if you look at this map here, you can see what Europe, different countries in Europe, like Britain and France, Germany, Russia, Japan, are basically controlling certain parts of the map of China and have major influence there in their economy, the trade in that region, the laws in that region. But they're not technically in control of China. China still has its own government and its own emperor. However, it is also pretty closed off outside of all these spheres of influence. And China is where a lot of luxury goods are produced: silk, porcelain, these things that a lot of Americans and people all over the world really want. But the thing is that there's not really a lot that the rest of the world has to offer that the Chinese want. And so everybody wants to trade with China, but China's really specific on who they're actually going to allow to trade with them. And they close off a lot of trade. And there's a guy in the U.S. that's pretty unpopular with this. So he's a guy, it's named John Hay, and he's a congressman, and he's going to issue what are called the open door notes. So the open door notes are basically saying, hey China, we know you probably don't like these European spheres of influence. So you know what? We got your back, right? We're going to defend your independence against Britain, France, and Germany, and Japan, and all these other powers. And in return, you should give us trading rights. You should have trading rights with the United States since we got your back, right? So it's kind of an underhanded way to try and get the U.S. involved. The Chinese actually don't really go along with this for well. They actually try to end up driving out foreigners. There is a rebellion called the Boxer Rebellion. A lot of American missionaries are killed in this rebellion, and it just turns out kind of not so great for the foreigners in China. But China does eventually become a pretty major U.S. ally. Next we have Japan. So Japan is unique as an Asian country because Japan was its own imperialist power. And really it's more like Europe than the rest of Asia is. And while Japan is out trying to kind of control parts of Europe, they get into a conflict with Russia over the territory of Korea. So if you look on this map here, you can see that Korea is right here in comparison to Japan. Excuse me. And then Russia is up here, right? So they're both pretty close, right? So they basically get into a war over who gets to control Korea. Japan wins the upper hand, but it's kind of a stalemate. Like, Russia could still keep fighting if they wanted to, and Japan, even though they have the upper hand, they really can't afford to keep fighting for much longer. So they can't come to an agreement, right? So they basically go to Teddy Roosevelt and they're like, hey man, you're pretty good at negotiating. Why don't you come and help us negotiate a treaty? So Theodore Roosevelt goes to Portsmouth and helps, or this is a boat actually, Portsmouth is a ship, sends a ship out to Portsmouth, and Russia and Japan get together with Roosevelt and they work out a deal. Japan gets Korea and Manchuria, so they do get a little bit of the upper hand of the treaty, but this ends the war. Roosevelt is actually going to win a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating this treaty. But what TR also does in this is he sends out what's called the Great White Fleet, and he's basically trying to show that the U.S. has this major naval power. This is the big stick again, right? So he's basically saying, look, we're going to negotiate this treaty for you, but I want you to know, you better not mess with us, right? So the Great White Fleet is actually just America's Navy, but they painted all of the ships white. It makes them stand out, and basically they go on this worldwide tour. Okay, so like I said, this is an example of big stick foreign policy. So just basically what they do is they start actually kind of in the Philippines, but just for the sake of this map, I've got them over on Australia. But they go up to Japan, through the Mediterranean, around the coast of Latin America, and back to the United States, just essentially circling the whole world. So everybody knows that the U.S. has a navy that they're willing to use, right? That's that big stick. So this is just one of the ships. You can see how they painted it white there, and you can imagine this would be pretty impressive. You know, these giant naval steamers going all around the world showing off the American naval power. So that's a pretty big deal. All right. Next, we have Colombia and Panama. And this one is interesting, okay? So this is while Teddy Roosevelt is president. Roosevelt decides he wants to build a canal through Panama. He got this idea from Alfred T. Mahan's book, The Influence of the Navy on Sea Power. However, Colombia controls Panama. So you see Colombia down here? So they're basically, Panama is basically a colony of Colombia. You can kind of think of it that way. The reason Panama is so important is because it's such a narrow strip of land. It's easy to cut through, and it'd be a really easy way to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific without having to sail all around Latin America. Just real quick, let's go back to this map just to let you know what I'm talking about. Basically, the way before the canal is built, the only way to get through is to go all the way around the tip. When you build that canal, it cuts through right here. So that's going to make it easier for countries, particularly the U.S., to get through, all right? So Roosevelt's got to figure out how in the world he's going to convince Colombia to give him control. Well, fortunately, there were some rebels in Panama who were trying to rebel against Colombian control. So the United States funds this rebellion. In fact, some people will say they encouraged this rebellion. They give them arms, they give them men, weapons, in order for them to successfully overthrow Colombia. In return, we negotiate a treaty with them. The same guy that issued the open door notes, John Hay, he's the one who negotiates this treaty with the people of Panama. And it basically says, since we helped you win a rebellion against Colombia, you give us the 10-mile stretch of land in order for us to build the Panama Canal. So you can see it right there on the map. It's right through this part. Now this is going to be an economic boom for the United States. It's going to allow trade much easier. We can charge people to use it. So every other country that's using it is going to have to pay to use our canal. Teddy Roosevelt is going to go on to say this was his greatest achievement as president. And this is still a canal that is active today. So again, you see this political cartoon here, Roosevelt using his big stick foreign policy, but in this sense, he's using it to threaten any bitty little Colombia who couldn't fight back if they wanted to, right? So what he's doing is threatening Colombia, essentially, by helping out this rebellion. This one is a pro-Theodore Roosevelt, so you can see that Roosevelt is pictured as digging the canal himself, kind of showing the majesty of what he's done and like how great this is for America here. This is an actual photograph of the building of the canal as they're trying to cut through the land. It took a lot of work, a lot of dynamite, a lot of men, but eventually I think it took about 10 years for the canal to officially be finished. The last one that we have is U.S. involvement in Mexico. So Mexico is an independent country, but we have not always been on great relationships with Mexico. So think about, before the Civil War, we fought a war with Mexico, right? The Mexican-American War. We took from them California, Texas, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, all these territories here. So we've not always been on great terms with Mexico by the 1900s. There is a rebellion in Mexico. Woodrow Wilson is the leader at this time. The Madero is the leader of Mexico, and Woodrow Wilson decides that he's going to recognize the rebellious leader instead of Madero. Madero was kind of more like a dictator. So the U.S. doesn't really want to recognize him. So instead they recognize a guy named Carranza, and he's that's going to kind of show up in American foreign policy here, where there are a lot of people in Mexico who don't like Carranza as the leader. One of them is a man named Pancho Villa. So Pancho Villa decides that he's going to show America that he doesn't like that we support Carranza. On the border at Texas, there are some Americans that are stationed there, some American troops that are stationed there. And Pancho Villa leads a raid and kills a little over 15 Americans. And it's pretty close to the Mexican border. It's pretty much in Mexico at this point. So think about this. We have Americans who are killed by this rebel leader America's not going to let that stand. So Woodrow Wilson sends John Pershing, who is an Army general, on an all-out manhunt looking for Pancho Villa. This is very similar to the manhunt that we put out after 9/11 for the leader that ran that, whose name I'm forgetting off the top of my head. You know who I mean. So anyway, this is very similar to that in the sense that we are sending men into a foreign country to look for this guy who kills Americans, right? After a while, Carranza, who, remember, we were friends with him, he's not really happy about the fact that there are 10,000 American troops in Mexico. Like, we've been there for a few years at this point, and he's pretty annoyed. Osama bin Laden, that's who I meant. Going back, a little ADD there. So this is similar to the hunt for Osama bin Laden after 9/11. But Carranza gets a little annoyed that there is this U.S. military presence in Mexico. He basically is worried that, like, what if they decide that they're going to try and take over Mexico? What if they decide they're going to try and like influence our government the way they've influenced Cuba or the Philippines? They basically think that they're being insulted by not really being given a lot of say in what the American troops are doing. And think about, we wouldn't be happy if, like, Mexico sent army up to the United States to look for somebody. After a while, we'd probably get a little annoyed ourselves. So eventually we do have to leave. Pancho Villa is not discovered. He will be killed separately from American troops, so we never do find him. This was a photograph of Pancho Villa, so you may have heard his name before. He's pretty famous for his mustache, actually, weirdly enough. So that's what we have there. So this wraps up just our look at American foreign policy. I hope this gives you a good picture of how a lot of these men kind of got involved with this and what they did that shows their different foreign policies. So here we go. I will see you guys in class.